Hello, good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Women's Magazine, a program that brings you or empower people with vital information to achieve their development targets. In our tonight's edition, we will take a look at women issues to empower women. In our first segment, this month is dedicated to women, that is the International Women's Day. In that light, hundreds of women leaders, including diplomats, parliamentarians, ministers, and women's rights activists in the late February gathered at the United Nations for the 56th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. This year's event, which was followed by the celebrations marking the International Women's Day, centered on rural women and their contributions to hunger and poverty eradication. The Gambia was represented at the high-level meeting by a multidisciplinary delegation headed by the Vice President and Minister of Women's Affairs, Dr. Aja Aissatou Sedi, who echoed the importance of Gambia government has attached to the welfare of rural women and girls. These and much more coming up in our tonight's edition of the Women's Magazine. I am Fatmata Simaha. Thank you for joining us. The Women Affairs Minister shared with the world gains registered by the government in the domain of women empowerment.
The attainment of gender equality, equity, and the empowerment of women have long been recognized by the government of the Gambia as an important prerequisite for sustainable development and progress. We therefore support the outcome as well as the conclusions of the 1995 Beijing Fourth Conference and indeed the 23rd session of the General Assembly on Women, but particularly the Beijing Platform for Action and its 12 critical areas of concern. In this respect, significant advancements have been made, anchoring heavily on closing the gender gap and the empowerment of our women and girls, with particular focus on rural women. Madam Chair, in the Gambia, about 65% of the agricultural labor force are female, and more than 89.94% of these live in the rural areas. Agriculture remains the main source of employment and livelihood for most women in the rural areas. Rural women, therefore, indeed play a very pivotal role in food and agricultural production, hunger, and poverty eradication. The Back to the Land initiative, led by our president himself, who is the main champion, eating what we grow and growing what we eat, is indeed a very important issue and plays a significant role in improving rural women's productivity by increasing access to agricultural inputs, such as farm machinery, training, seeds, fertilizers, domestic labor-saving devices, such as milling machines, dehauling and decorticating equipment, tractors and power tillers, among others. Madam Chair, government continues to support resource-poor rural producers, with special attention to women horticultural, poultry, and livestock farmers. Through the Livestock Horticultural Development Project, 12,000 farmers, most of whom are female, are directly benefiting from this support. This initiative is indeed an integral part of the Gambia government's program for accelerated growth and employment, PAGE, which is aimed at attaining the overall development goal of reducing rural poverty by raising rural food security and incomes, indeed on a sustainable basis. Madam Chair, in relation to the financing for gender equality and the empowerment of women, government, with the support from development partners and the private sector, have over the years implemented activities culminating in increases in women's access to education, productive resources, and credit. Indeed, significant increases have been made and registered in the number of women in decision-making positions. For example, in politics, at the level of cabinet, we have 43% of the current cabinet being female, 13 of the National Assembly also being women, and increasingly, women continue to occupy top management positions in the civil as well as public services, and indeed the private sector and NGOs. Capacity building for potential women leaders to increase their participation in productive ventures continues to occupy center stage in all our endeavors for women's empowerment. Gender-based violence and sexual offenses bills are being finalized for enactment. Capacity building in gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, planning and management, monitoring and evaluation have been carried out for ministers, members of the National Assembly, heads of institutions, and staff of gender machinery, and indeed including gender focal points in government, the private sector, as well as NGOs. Madam Chair, the empowerment of rural women and their role in poverty and hunger eradication are not without challenges, however. Gender inequality has persistently existed, especially with access to as well as control over productive and financial resources. A good number of rural women, Madam Chair, still lack ownership and control over key productive as well as financial resources, and therefore cannot boost their production or even venture into large-scale commercial farming. Consequently, this has impacted negatively on food self-sufficiency and security. Concerted efforts continue to be made in advancing gender equity, equality, and the empowerment of women and girls. The Gambia has made significant achievements in MDG 3, having achieved gender parity in education at the basic levels, thanks to the President's Empowerment of Girls Education Project, and of course the Education Trust Fund and the Jami Foundation for Peace, among others.